Any hopes you might have had for the Atlanta Falcons trading Kirk Cousins are now dead.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week later in today's episode. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So on today's episode, we are talking about the King, Kevin King, being back. It's going to be a mock draft Monday, and we'll talk about a potential second-round target in Notre Dame cornerback Benjamin Morrison, and maybe he's the ideal second-round target for the Atlanta Falcons, and we'll break that down. But, of course, it is Monday, and so that means we got some Kirk Cousins news to update you, because every single development when it comes to the Kirk Cousins saga ongoing in Atlanta always seems to happen over the weekend. So every Monday there's a slightly different wrinkle, a little bit more context. So the latest on the Kirk Cousins saga is not involving the Atlanta Falcons, it's involving the Cleveland Browns, who signed Joe Flacco as their veteran bridge starting quarterback over the weekend, and that pretty much takes Kirk Cousins off the table for the Cleveland Browns as a potential trade partner. And this is important because the Cleveland Browns seem to be the most realistic and most likely option for the Falcons to trade Kirk Cousins after the draft when he's willing to waive his no trade clause. And so whether you're looking at Locked On Browns, whether you're looking at, the various Browns beat writers, even the ones that a month ago were sitting here telling us that they felt like Kirk Cousins to Cleveland is an inevitability, are basically saying that this is the Browns' answer for that question, right? That the Browns' QB plans were to have 2 veteran quarterbacks in their building, an experienced one. Now, with Joe Flacco, Kirk Cousins would have filled that shoes, had him competing with another younger veteran, which they added earlier this offseason, and Kenny Pickett, trading for him, and coupling that with the third quarterback being an eventual draft pick, in 11 days as I sit here recording this, if and when the Browns decide to use one of their top selections in this upcoming draft on a quarterback, having the second overall pick in round 1 and the first pick in round 2, which a lot of people are assuming one of those picks will be a quarterback, right? And that's the main reason why Kirk Cousins, as a potential eventual Cleveland Brown, depending on who you ask, was waiting till after the draft, because if the Browns used their top pick, that number 2 overall selection on a quarterback, Kirk was not going to waive his no trade clause to go to Cleveland, because he knows there's a ticking clock on him. But in a world where the Browns wait till round 2, which I think is what the general expectation is at this point in time, that would open the door. But the Joe Flacco news pretty much kills that. And so, this is a golden opportunity for me to be petty and do I told you so, but I'm not going to do that, right? But it is going back to a conversation we had earlier this offseason of why I didn't think the Kirk Cousins trade would happen, because I just didn't think other teams would be that interested in renting Kirk Cousins for now at this point $37.5 million for 1 year. The only team that seems to want to make that type of investment in Kirk Cousins is the Atlanta Falcons, based off of what they did last year. That $27 million bonus or base salary that Kirk is due this year, plus the $10 million roster bonus that is now fully guaranteed next year, is basically what a team trading for Kirk Cousins would do. And basically every Browns beat writer in person is the Browns had to go through too many hoops to acquire Kirk Cousins, agreeing with the Falcons on splitting that base money, giving up a draft pick, all that stuff. And it was just like, it's just so much easier for us, as I thought it would be, to go out there and sign someone like a Joe Flacco, give him a 1 year, $4 million deal. He's a bridge quarterback. Why are we spending $1 bajillion on a bridge quarterback? A lesson that the Falcons probably could learn. But he's getting some incentives on that. So if he actually performs well, and the Browns made their choice. So Now we sit here as Falcon fans hoping that, well, if the Browns aren't going to make a trade, someone else is going to make a trade. And we sit here and hope that the Falcons basically luck up into a trade between now and the start of the season if the goal is to trade Kirk Cousins at this point in time, but it doesn't seem very likely. And unfortunately for the Falcons, because if they can't figure out a trade for Kirk Cousins between now and June 2nd, where if they were to trade Kirk Cousins after the draft before June 2nd, they would be in a very favorable financial situation going into 2026, right? That's been kind of the Falcons' whole mantra. We've talked about that on the podcast, where the Falcons are basically willing to slow play this offseason because they expect to get a windfall of cash next offseason after they move on from Kirk Cousins. And so if they can't get a trade between now and June 2nd, right, if they were to get a trade between now and June 2nd, is probably the better way to frame it, then they would be in a position where they would carry $0 in dead money for Kirk Cousins in 2026, right? That's the ideal situation, right? Now, if you trade Kirk Cousins later this summer after June 2nd, you would still carry about $25 million in dead money in 2026. If you don't trade Kirk Cousins at all this year, between now and the trade deadline, which is in November, and carry him on the roster for the entire year, and then you wind up cutting or trading him next year, you're going to basically carry the same amount of dead money, right? A trade would be $25 million in dead money next year, and a cut would be $35 million, but 10 of that would offset potentially from the roster bonus or whatever. So it'd be the 25 plus the 10. And basically there's no difference between what I thought the Falcons should have done, just cutting Kirk Cousins and letting this go and being willing to let Kirk Cousins play for another team for cheap or whatever. It's like, whatever, we don't care. But now the situation is the Falcons are, in that situation, if they had cut Kirk Cousins, they'd be eating $40 million in dead money this year and $25 million in dead money next year. And based off of the current situation, it looks like the Falcons are going to be eating $40 million in cap hit this year for Kirk to be on the team and $25 million in dead money next year. So there's no difference financially from cutting Kirk Cousins back in March versus keeping Kirk Cousins. The only difference is in this scenario that Kirk Cousins is going to be kept, that you actually have the potential of getting his on-field production, which, I'm sure some of you guys think is worthwhile. And certainly, I'd probably much rather have Kirk Cousins as my backup quarterback than Carson Wentz, but at the same time, whatever. Anyway, so we'll see. We'll see if Kirk Cousins gets on the field this year and thus makes this investment likely. And so, having a $50 million backup, that $40 million plus the $10 million next year, makes him the best backup, the highest paid backup quarterback in NFL history. So clearly he's the best backup ever in the history of the sport. So that makes it worthwhile, I guess. We can cross that box, check that box, right, if we're the Falcons. So, I know you're sitting there going, but Aaron, they could still trade Kirk Cousins later this summer. It's like, sure, that's a possibility. It's a very low possibility. Yeah, I can sit here and say with 99% confidence that it's probably not going to happen, right? Because we've had basically 3 starting quarterbacks go down with injuries before the season-ending injuries before the season. Like, guys get hurt all the time in training camp, but it doesn't prompt teams to go out there and we saw this with Justin Herbert last year. We saw this with Russell Wilson last year, right? Those guys got hurt in training camp, but the Chargers traded for a backup quarterback, but no one's going to want Kirk to be a $27.5 million backup this year, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, again, only the Atlanta Falcons are going to pay that type of premium for a backup quarterback. So the situation that you're hoping for if you're the Falcons is a season-ending injury to another quarterback, and that's basically happened 3 times in the last decade, right? That when you do the math on that, that's less than a 1% chance, right? The 3 times it's happened, right, was in 2016 when Teddy Bridgewater got hurt, and then the Vikings traded for Sam Bradford. In 2016, when Tony Romo got hurt, he missed the first 10 games of the season, and the Cowboys in that time tossed the keys to this, up-and-coming rookie by the name of Dak Prescott. And then in 2017, when Ryan Tannehill, I think, tore his ACL during training camp, and the Dolphins went out and signed Jay Cutler. So out of the 3 times it's happened in 10 years, and again, we have 32 different opportunities every single season. So 320 opportunities for a team to deal with that type of injury that we're talking about that will facilitate a Kirk Cousins trade. And it's happened 3 times. 3 out of 320 is 0.9% probability, right, of this happening this summer. That's why I sit here and I say with 99% confidence, it's not going to happen. It could happen. There's a 1% chance it could happen again. There's a 1% chance, guys, but 99% probability that it won't happen. that the Falcons are going to be able to get a trade with Kirk Cousins because some team is going to be so desperate because not, hey, their quarterback is going to miss 4 to 6 games. No, it's going to be their quarterback is going to miss 14 to 16 games. And so therefore they're going to be so desperate to be like, we'll give the Falcons a call for Kirk Cousins. So I sit here and I say 99% confidence, 99% probability that Kirk Cousins is going to be an Atlanta Falcon come week 1. So we will see how that goes. We will continue on this illustrious podcast talking about Kirk Cousins, who's by all means the biggest story for the Atlanta Falcons this offseason. Isn't it an incredible achievement that the Falcons, we're still talking about Kirk Cousins in mid-April, and we're going to be still talking about Kirk Cousins in mid-May and mid-June and mid-July and mid-August and mid-September and mid-October and mid-November and mid-December and mid-Jan. Man, aren't you guys excited for all the tremendous content that's coming your way here on Locked On Falcons? Talk about Kirk Cousins. Man, what an achievement. So looking forward to that, guys. Again, maybe the Steelers pivot off of Aaron Rodgers and we get a post-draft trade to him in Pittsburgh. So you can hold out a hope. Again, we'll see on that front. Go check out Locked On Steelers to see, what's the odds of that thing going down. Again, you're going to have to absorb $27.5 million with Kirk Cousins, and you'll probably be able to get Aaron Rodgers for cheaper than that, right? Probably, in all likelihood. All right. So we'll see. We'll see on that front. So that we'll leave the Kirk Cousins conversation aside, and we'll get into what we all want to talk about on a Monday. It's Mock Draft Monday, baby. And let's talk about a potential round 2 target, maybe perhaps the perfect round 2 target for the Atlanta Falcons at the cornerback position. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, did you know that your Fire TV is also an Xbox? Turn any TV into your gaming and entertainment hub with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe or sign into Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to play. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 and Avowed as easily as you stream your favorite shows. It's a gaming made simple, and it's all on your Fire TV. And don't forget the endless 4K streaming and watch more than 1.5 million movies and TV shows from your favorite subscribe services like Netflix, Prime Video, Disney Plus, Max, and more. So whether you're a hardcore or casual gamer or not interested in video games, Fire TV has got you covered. Head to Amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices, including Fire TV Stick 4K, 2nd gen, Fire TV Stick 4K Max, 1st and 2nd gen, and Fire TV Cube, 3rd gen. So the big focus of a lot of the content that we'll be doing draft-wise this week is going to be about, the Falcons round 2 options. And so we'll probably spend a good chunk of today's, the next couple of episodes talking about some of the cornerbacks that the Falcons could target in round 2. But, we're going to do Mock Draft Monday a little bit differently today because we're going to look at a 2-round mock draft from Mel Kiper from this past week. And focus on the 2nd round option because we've discussed the 1st round options at nauseam. So in Mel's mock, he had the Falcons taking Mike Green, the edge rusher from Marshall in round 1. We've talked a bunch about how Mike Green is potentially, the plan A for the Falcons at pick 15 based off of their recent draft history. And so go check out Thursday's episode, I believe, is where we took a deep dive with Wednesday or Thursday of last week. They all blur together, guys. But then Mel had Benjamin Morrison, the Notre Dame cornerback, in round 2. So let's talk about Benjamin Morrison. And in theory, depending on where you feel about Benjamin Morrison, and I don't know where I ultimately fall into Benjamin Morrison just because I've watched like 2 games of his at this point in time, or really 3, I guess. Yeah, watched 3. But like you could, many will argue that Benjamin Morrison could be one of the bigger steals in this draft should he go in round 2, because many would argue that if not for his hip injury, we'd be talking about him potentially as a round 1 option for the Atlanta Falcons at pick 15. And I think that's definitely a possibility that if he had stayed healthy this past year, that we'd be talking about him as a 1st round corner lock and potentially a top 15 pick. And maybe if you count Travis Hunter as at Colorado as a CB1 of this year's draft class, that Benjamin Morrison, I think, would have a pretty compelling case to be CB2 in this draft class. So, getting that guy at pick 46 in this, mock draft scenario that Mel Kiper of ESPN laid out makes a ton of sense. Now, the injury is probably the biggest concern with Benjamin Morrison. He played 6 games this past year before suffering a hip injury. This is the 2nd time he's had a season-ending hip injury. He had his first one happened, I think, his final year of high school football. He also dealt with a shoulder surgery last offseason as well. So really the biggest knock on Benjamin Morrison at this point in time is not his play on the field. It's really his inability it's the ability to stay off on the field, due to those durability concerns that have been prevalent over the last 4 or so years. Now, when it comes to on the field conversation about Benjamin Morrison, I think it's interesting to kind of juxtapose him against Will Johnson, who is a player that is frequently mocked and projected to the Falcons as that CB2 to be the second corner off the board for the Falcons at pick 15, especially if you go to the various NFL.com mock drafts where it seems like they're the ones that are consistently projecting Will Johnson to be the Falcons pick at pick 15 over at NFL.com. But the reason why we contrast these two is because Will Johnson is primarily an off-zone corner, while Benjamin Morrison is primarily a press man coverage corner. And that is usually why I sit here and I say, like, he could arguably be CB2 over Will Johnson, is because that press man skill set is something that NFL teams typically covet a lot more and put a lot more of a premium on. Now, when we did our first mock draft Monday after the Super Bowl back in early to mid-February, we talked about Will Johnson and his potential scheme fit in Atlanta because of how much the Falcons rely on that off-zone skill set when it comes to their cornerbacks last year. And we'll talk a little bit later about hopefully that changes. But to look at the data, according to Pro Football Focus, Johnson spent about 13% of his snaps last year in press coverage or 14% in man coverage. And you compare that to the Falcons' usage of press coverage, in at least in the first 6 weeks of the season where we have PFF data for that. Mike Hughes only played about 1% press coverage. AJ Terrell was about 8% press coverage. And the NFL average, according to PFF, was about 11%. And you compare that to, say, the Jets corners, now that Jeff Ulbrich is here, former Jets defensive coordinator, they spent about 20% of their snaps in press coverage, which was near the top of the league through the first 6 games of the season. So one wonders, where the Falcons will fit in on that. But if the Falcons want to continue to be this off-zone bend but don't break defense, that makes a ton of sense for a guy like Will Johnson, for them to value him a little bit higher. But if they want to be a little bit more of that press-heavy scheme, as we saw in the second half of the season when the Falcons were dialing up more press, we saw AJ Terrell's play pick up. That's something that AJ is very comfortable with. He was one of the top press guys in 2023 under Ryan Nielsen. But you compare that with Benjamin Morrison, according to PFF, 60% of his coverage snaps last year were in press, and about 60% were in man coverage, which puts him basically at the top of this draft class. And so, again, that's a skill set that NFL teams covet, and hopefully, personally, I think the Falcons should also covet. I particularly covet when I'm looking at these cornerbacks. When I'm looking at who I would like to see the Falcons draft, I would like them to draft a guy that isn't an off-zone corner like a Will Johnson out of Michigan versus someone like a Benjamin Morrison, who is more of that press man corner, because it goes back to the conversation we've had a number of times now on the podcast over the last couple of weeks, which is that you're hoping that you can get significant upgrades in the cornerback position in the back end of your defense that's going to allow you to be a little bit more aggressive on the front end to supplement the pass rush that we're all worried about not necessarily being there, even with the selection of a Mike Green or some other top pass rusher in this draft class, that you're not going to just simply be able to rely on getting pressure with 4 guys, and you're going to have to be able to bring pressure with simulated pressures, with Caden Ellis, with 5 and 6 man pressures. And you can only really do that if you get significantly better play in the back end. And I do think Benjamin Morrison makes a ton of sense if that's the goal, and to get more press man. And hey, we're going to press these guys at the line of scrimmage. We're going to disrupt the timing of these routes at the line of scrimmage. That's going to force the quarterback to hold on to the football a little bit longer, and that's going to give our pass rush more time to get home, as opposed to what we saw last year with that bend but don't break. Everybody's playing off, and so the quarterback can just basically, okay, you're just going to concede, I can, 7-8 yards, whatever it is. And that's why NFL teams completed the highest percentage of completion rate against the Falcons defense of any defense in the league last year. Those are all related. And so to me, Benjamin Morrison, selecting a player like Benjamin Morrison, and there are other guys potentially on that round 2 radar at the quarterback position that also have that press man skill set that I think would make a ton of sense for the Falcons. But Morrison certainly takes the cake when it comes to how he was utilized at Notre Dame. And so this sort of combination of that edge rusher that we definitely know is going to be the Falcons' #1 overall pick, like a Mike Green in round 1, coupled with a Benjamin Morrison in round 2. This is the type of haul that the Falcons can get in the first 2 rounds of this draft that would actually have me on this podcast saying positive things about the Atlanta Falcons and their draft plans and all that stuff. And you guys know, like, that's a crazy sort of thing. It's like, it's not even possible. It's not even fathomable that I could sit here on this podcast and be like, the Falcons are doing actually a pretty good job in the draft and whatnot. So, to me, a guy like Morrison could be that sort of cornerstone player and potentially, if he lives up to his potential, could give the Falcons one of the best cornerback duos in the NFL. If you see Benjamin Morrison as that type of guy that would normally be a top 15 pick in most drafts, had he not been injured. So, yeah, I like this mock draft from Mel Kiper. So we'll see if the Falcons follow suit on that, especially given that they just re-signed Kevin King, which suggests that maybe the Falcons aren't going to prioritize the cornerback position at the top of the draft with a selection like Benjamin Morrison. We'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, the Armada Player of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. And each week, we're taking a look at our draft prospects and picking one guy that stands apart, the guy we believe showcases the strength and power needed to push the Atlanta Falcons forward as we look ahead to next season. And this week's Armada Clear-Cut Player of the Week is none other than Notre Dame cornerback Benjamin Morrison. And when we have big dreams for the NFL draft, this is going big with one of the top cornerbacks in round 2, giving you that physical cornerback position, that that heavy duty ruggedness that we all love with the Nissan Armada. And while Benjamin Morrison can sit there and say go forth and conquer when it comes to NFL wide receivers, the Nissan Armada is doing the exact same thing and conquering the road with confidence. And so make sure you check out the Nissan Armada or the other outstanding vehicles from Nissan. Take the Nissan Armada Rogue or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure at shopnissanusa.com. So the Falcons re-signed Kevin King on Friday, bookending a week where they started off by re-signing Dee Alford and ending the week by re-signing Kevin King. And now we know that the Falcons carried 7 cornerbacks for the most part in the back half of last season on their roster. 6 of those 7 are back: Dee Alford, Natron Brooks, Mike Hughes, Kevin King, Clark Phillips, and A.J. Terrell. The only one that's not back is Antonio Hamilton, who's currently an unsigned, unrestricted free agent. So Falcons are essentially replacing Hamilton with Mike Ford to come in and play special teams, because that was primarily what Hamilton was expected to do last year, outside of that one game where he got absolutely annihilated by Mike Evans in week 5. But, I was surprised to see the Falcons re-sign Kevin King, just because I thought, they got a similar type of player on the roster already by signing Keith Taylor in that first week of free agency, getting another tall cornerback that is a little younger, that at least in theory, because Keith Taylor is only 26, you can at least pretend, whether you believe this in reality or not, but you can pretend that, hey, there's some untapped potential with Keith Taylor. He hasn't played really much of any snaps in the last 2 years. So there's still some developmental upside with Keith Taylor, and we can't really pretend that with Kevin King, who's going to turn 30 in May. We've seen the best of Kevin King. The best of Kevin King is not particularly good as Packers fans, right? So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, what's the end game here? And so we saw last year with Kevin King serving as the team's primary dime defensive back, that 6 DB, when the Falcons would go to their dime looks. And primarily he was asked to cover tight ends in those situations. And so I could imagine the Falcons are bringing back Kevin King just to give them a floor for a potential competition between him and Keith Taylor for one of these 6 or possibly 7 cornerback spots that the Falcons wind up keeping, similar to the conversation we were having the other day with Jarvis Davis when it came to why the Falcons brought back Dee Alford at the beginning of the week, to give them a floor for that Clark Phillips can come in and take Dee Alford's job in competition later this summer. But my main concern is, like, the Falcons running it back with these 6 cornerbacks plus adding Mike Ford means that they're not going to particularly prioritize the cornerback in the draft, because they have more than enough bodies on their roster to, make the 6 or 7 guys that they're going to wind up keeping on their 53 roster. And this is basically the same argument I made back in March when the Falcons brought back all their backup offensive linemen. And basically I said, hey, I don't think offensive line, whether we're talking about center, whether we're talking about tackle, is going to be a high priority for this team because of their emphasis on re-signing these offensive linemen, where they brought back basically 9 out of 11 offensive linemen that they carried for a large chunk of last season, minus Drew Dalman, minus Matt Hennessy. And so the idea of prioritizing re-signing guys like Brandon Parker and Elijah Wilkinson and others during that first week of free agency, guys that served primarily as your 9th and 10th offensive linemen and thus were inactive on game days, does not suggest that this is a team that is eager to try to bolster their offensive line come the draft. But I think that's the key difference, right? The Falcons re-signed all those offensive linemen in the first wave of free agency, as opposed, basically on March 12th and 13th, they basically re-signed like 4 offensive linemen on those dates. And these cornerback moves are happening now in the second week of April, right? And so that to me is the big difference, where the offensive line depth was a priority where it came to, signing those guys at the outset of free agency, while the cornerback room is just more of an afterthought because, basically a month went by before the Falcons decided to bring back Alford and Kevin King. So that's why I will continue to, gaslight myself, for lack of a better term, into thinking that cornerback will remain a priority for this team coming into the draft. And I'll continue to be skeptical of offensive tackle being a priority, and why you've heard me and others on this podcast talk about it potentially being a smokescreen for this team, and that they're not really that interested in drafting an offensive lineman, and they're really just trying to entice another team to kind of trade up in that regard, a team like Houston. So we will see on that front. But that is going to do it for us guys here on today's Locked On Falcons. Hopefully, we'll see what Kirk Cousins updates we get a week from now. We'll see what other moves are on the horizon for the Atlanta Falcons, but we'll continue the discussion about some of these round 2 cornerback options as this week unfolds, as well as, potential offensive line and defensive tackle and, pass rushing options. And in the event that, again, it's crazy to think about the Falcons not taking an edge rusher in round 1, So when we talk about taking an edge rusher in round 2, it's more the idea of they're double dipping, because there's no possible way that the Atlanta Falcons would draft anything other than an edge rusher with their first round pick in this year's draft. So, those will all be topics that we can continue to explore as the week unfolds. So make sure you check out Locked On Falcons as your first listen by subscribing or following free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. Keith Sanchez, Damian Parson, giving you the scoop and lowdown on all things 2025 NFL Draft. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every